good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are in the country. And thank you for joining us today for this NASPA live briefing. Let's talk about emergency aid, creating pathways for student success and college completion. My name is Diana Ali. I work as a policy analyst within NASPA for 2 years now. And before that, I was doing advocacy work and have been doing that work for some time in the Chicagoland community. So I'm very interested in the topic that we'll be discussing today, which offers a means of access for low-income students. And so with that, I am excited to turn it over to Amy Geist and allow her to introduce herself and dive on into the presentation.
Thank you, Diana. So as she mentioned, my name is Amy Geist, and I am a Director of Strategic Initiatives with NASPA. I have also been with NASPA about 2 years, working on this effort that we have toward support of emergency aid work that many institutions are doing to support students. Prior to this, I worked at institutions in a couple different areas with student activities and in some other areas of university administration. So I'm very glad to be here and to talk about this today, and I would invite all kinds of contact and questions and further discussion. My information is there and is also at the end, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with you if you're interested. So to jump into the information, I want to just start by saying that, the reason why we are talking about emergency aid, really there are lots of reasons. Many of them are centered in things like these statistics that, over 3 million students are taking some time off, stop out or drop out for what we have found is a small but time-critical financial issue that hits them at some point during their tenure in college, and the fact that college affordability continues to be a challenge today and is still part of that conversation. Institutions have to think about the changing demographics of today's students and think about those who are attending part-time or caring for aging parents or our parents themselves, returning veterans, they're low income sometimes, and that there are all these different complex circumstances that they bring with them that impact their experience as a student. And so moving on from this, on the next slide, you'll see we know that there are lots of different non-academic barriers that students face on their path. So there are a lot of things that come up. There are, a variety of challenges that they're facing. And truthfully, we know that part of it is just that life gets in the way. So as institutions do this work, they need to think about how pervasive these challenges are for their populations, and then also to think about the institutional policies, practices, and procedures that might unintentionally be creating barriers for students, such as the date of payment is due if it doesn't jive well with the allocation of the financial aid disbursement. And how those partners can get together to discuss an alternative that would alleviate that barrier. So on the next slide, you'll note too some information that we always like to share from the Federal Reserve Board study that helps us understand that financial insecurity can really happen to anyone at any time. This report indicates that 44% of those respondents couldn't cover a $400 expense without selling something or borrowing money. The 2014 report indicated 47%, but this is really a reality for many American households, not just college students. So Diana's going to talk a little bit about the federal policy conversations from here, and then we'll look at how that's connected.
Thank you, Amy. I just wanted to build in some context on this conversation on emergency aid by laying out some of the considerations within the higher ed federal policy landscape that may have an impact on low-income students, many of whom, as Amy has begun to outline, become the recipients of emergency aid at colleges and universities. So the first piece, and there's a lot here, so we're just going to do kind of like a broad outline to really just set the context. And the first piece I wanted to point to is that of actually an unprecedented move for Congress in the last 2 weeks, in which the Senate last week and then the House this week have both negotiated and passed a massive spending bill inclusive of education appropriation allotments onto the desk of President Trump. And it looks like that is going to be signed into law before the end of the fiscal year deadline, which is this coming Sunday, September 30th. And I'll talk a little bit more about the unprecedented nature of that on the next slide. But this bill is being viewed largely as a win for higher ed advocates. There are some reservations regarding it, and some of those are outlined within a recent American Council on Education statement submitted to Congress that NASPA has signed on to, if you want to check that out on our RPI weekly update, where we post our statements that we've signed on to. But regardless, this legislation in major ways expands opportunities for access and success for low-income students. And to give you a sense, the bill includes a $100 funding increase for maximum Pell Grant eligibility, increased funding for college access, including TRIO and Gear Up programming, $70 million in increases to Perkins Career and Technical Education grants, leveled funding for the Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant and Federal Work Study, and certain allotments for student borrowers. And the next piece I wanted to point to is that of the Farm Bill. So Congress really continues to lack movement on pushing this forward. We're now expecting the consideration of this legislation to be taken up during the lame duck session after midterm elections. But the reason why the Farm Bill is an important part of this conversation around low-income students is because the current House version of the bill, H.R. 2, which will probably be negotiated through a more bipartisan Senate, has been shown in a recent study by Mathematica Policy Research that should it pass as it currently stands, nearly 2 million households receiving SNAP benefits, which are food stamps, would no longer be eligible. So certainly some implications there. And then I just wanted to touch on HEA reauthorization. So many of you know that the Prosper Act, which was the House version of the bill that moved out of committee in December 2017, was unable to make it to the House floor due to some of the more stringent parts of the bill and some of the pushback and contention in regards to reaching a compromise. And this legislation proposed cuts to many of the programming I just mentioned, where we're actually seeing funding increases within the Labor H bill. But like I said, we're not currently seeing movement on the Prosper Act at this time. I also wanted to mention the Democrat-led version of reauthorization released in July 2018, which is the Aim Higher Act. And we're really watching that because it provides marker legislation that might be introduced should the House switch party control after the upcoming midterm elections. If you're interested in more information and a more thorough analysis on either of these, I would check out the American Council on Education, has done some definitely work around Prosper. I mean, NASPA has also put out information on Prosper on our RPI blog. And then for Aim Higher, the National Association of Federal Student Financial Aid Administrators, or NASFA, has some really great resources available on their website. And there's also a link to some of that information on our most recent RPI blog on the NASPA RPI page as well. So I just wanted to switch gears really quickly before I turn it back over to Amy to really quickly address how various processes at play might affect the passage of this legislation that I just outlined. For instance, the upcoming fiscal year deadline on Sunday has been a major reason why, or has been so readily met by Congress because of our upcoming midterm elections. The appropriations legislation has really flown through the negotiations process because congressional representatives are so focused on getting on the campaign trail. And the outcomes of midterms will greatly affect what we're likely to see in terms of movement for HEA reauthorization. For example, as I mentioned, if the House flips, we are likely to see legislation matching the Aim Higher Act. But if both parties flip, we might be met with some kind of stalemate due to partisan differences between Congress and the administration. So the outcome of the upcoming election will very likely affect these policies that we're discussing that will likely impact low-income students. And so we're really just waiting to see what happens on November 6th. And the Public Policy Division at NASPA will be offering a virtual town hall discussing further implications of the election. So please do look out for that in our monthly constituent group policy post that goes out. So I will turn it back over to Amy now to talk more about emergency aid.
Great, thank you. Just as a quick point on that, in thinking about how those federal conversations are going to have some effect on the institutional application of emergency aid, those items related to SNAP benefits are definitely going to have an impact. Many students are receiving those. Our institutions are assisting them in applying for and pursuing those kind of support mechanisms, so that could be an issue there for the food insecurity issues that students face. And I had a conversation yesterday in which a colleague from a community college relayed a few concerns related to the PROSPER Act, such as things like if there is a 30-day holdout, that could have an impact on students who need the funding for something like childcare. That community college has 8-week courses, and so the session would be half over by the time the student would receive that disbursement. And if there are restrictions, what if the funds can only be used for tuition and fees but not books? So there are a lot of questions out there, and there's a lot of uncertainty and concern about how some of these decisions will have an effect, and then therefore have an additional layer of what support may be needed from the institutions to support the students. So NASPA has been involved in the emergency aid conversation for a while. We had some funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to do a landscape analysis of the field in 2015 and released this report in 2016, which is available for download from the NASPA website as well as on the Student Arc site, which I'll tell you more about in a little bit, to share what was happening across the country in all different types of institutions and highlight great work that's happening, and also to think about what's coming next. The next slide will show you the working definition that we had for emergency aid, which covers a variety of types of aid, but really, and the amounts, but really institutions decide for themselves what constitutes an emergency, how much funding they will allow, how many times a student can access the funds, and of course are not necessarily always offering all these different types of aid. So the next slide will show you that there are some notes about the key findings from the landscape analysis. So really, as a brief summary on this, the points are that this emergency financial and humanitarian support is happening at more than 70% of the responding institutions and has been happening for more than 3 years at 80% of them. That was in 2015, so it's been happening for much longer than that. We also learned and discussed the 6 main types of aid, being things like restricted grants or unrestricted grants, loans, completion scholarships, food pantries, and vouchers, with food pantries being the second leading type of aid at both 2- and 4-year public institutions. And then things about communication and data were areas with lots of questions and uncertainty about who to communicate with and how widely to publicize, since word of mouth was the primary way students are finding out about most of these programs. And then also in terms of what data to collect, how to manage putting that into someone's responsibilities to start using data to identify students, how to use predictive analytics to maybe identify populations that could benefit from this type of support and to make sure that they're communicated with. And then in terms of funding source, that is generally coming from foundation or development or some kind of an institutional budget line, but thinking ahead for institutions to try to look at other resources like alumni or faculty and staff payroll deduction or different things like that that might be areas for them to focus on in future fundraising efforts. And then with scaling barriers, that lack of funding is the primary reason cited, with the concern about the ability to serve more students and not being able to meet those needs, which of course connects back to the communication and the data piece as well. So it really is all very related. And as we continue working with institutions, this slide shows you a number of the questions that we get, which of course we try to assist with in providing the support we have, but really helping to know exactly what the institutional population needs, how to be collaborative and integrated with everyone else on campus who's doing something, and making sure we know what's happening by other staff members and faculty across campus. things about raising funds for what is needed. That might be money to allocate to students in need, or might be for facility needs like refrigerators to have perishable food items in a food pantry. And then thinking about the communication strategy to reach the right people and how we're educating faculty and staff about the resources, as well as letting students know who might need the resources. And then really thinking about assessing the effectiveness of the efforts that are being made. So to assist institutions in these efforts, we have launched this website, studentarc.org, which you'll see more information about here. And we want this to be a place for the community of practice to find resources as well as share resources. So the kinds of things that are here, there's background information about different facets of emergency aid, common terms and definitions, just some of the basics. There are examples of how other institutions are implementing different types of aid and their insights about partnerships on campus as well as in the community. There are research and reports from a variety of different sources, news articles related to emergency aid, and there's an opportunity and an open invitation for all of people involved in a variety of different ways to share resources from their own institution or something that they found from another source that they thought was helpful as they were putting together what they were going to do or implementing something or their procedures. Stories of how emergency aid has impacted individual students or those involved in the work, students that are involved on some level for allocating funds to their peers, or individual students who have benefited from this, or any of the different perspectives involved. And then their next slide will show you that there are different types of tools and content that are on the website. So we have the emergency aid rubric, which has become a very popular tool for institutions to use in assessing their current state and to identify next steps and the direction in which to head with their efforts and where to go. Or things like a report from Rios Partners, who has a partner grant with ours to work with a select group of institutions to do some pretty intense work in crafting the right services and approach for their institution. We have reports from groups like Lumina's Beyond Financial Aid report, things like that. We also have a how-to guide for the rubric to assist institutions as they approach that and using that tool. Interviews and blogs from individuals at institutions and associations. And we also have sample graphics and different resources that have been successful, and people have shared those with us so that others can see the types of information that's out there. And we also are happy to promote events. So the Real College gathering this weekend, as well as the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board convening that took place earlier this month, are a couple of examples. So we certainly welcome any of you to share your events or resources with us if you would like us to help promote those and to share them around with others. And of course, we are active on social media through Twitter and on LinkedIn as well. So please follow us and share information that way and get engaged in the conversation, ask questions that way, or any other ways to share things. So I hope this has been helpful. I've got a few closing slides on the next slide, few closing thoughts on the next slide. So really, emergency aid can be a powerful tool for supporting students and thinking about how we partner this with the effect of the financial policies and federal policies that are coming through and state policies. It's really important to make sure that the institutional policies and practices are in compliance, and that student affairs and financial aid and everyone else who's involved in this work are working together to make sure that they're in compliance, because that can have some additional impact on the student. And so making sure that that's a strong partnership on campus is really important. So those are all the thoughts, and we're happy to move into questions at this point. But again, I invite you to reach out over email or through social media if you prefer, so we can continue the conversation.
Thanks so much, Amy. So we currently do not have any questions from folks. So while we're waiting for those to roll in, we did have a question asking about even more additional resources or upcoming events. And I know that you went into some of that, but just wondering if there's anything coming up around the corner in terms of the work of Student ARC and emergency aid that you feel like we should know that you weren't able to mention already.
Absolutely, thank you. So one of the areas I just did mention, the partnership between student affairs and financial aid, that's one of the areas where we have more in development. So NASPA, as Diana mentioned earlier, the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, is going to be working with us to provide some more resources for the Student Arc site to help give more shape to the information people need about working with financial aid and the partnerships that are necessary there, information that those of us who were not trained in the financial aid area need to know in approaching these kind of things and how this can impact a student. So we do have a lot more coming from our partnership with NASPA, as well as with financial aid staff at a variety of institutions. So again, I would be happy, I welcome anything in that area as well, if that's something that you have a question about, or you have a resource or a good person that you've been in touch with, or something that is working well on your institutional campus, or something that's not working well and you want some assistance with, or have a conversation. Those are great points to get in touch and to share about, so that we can try to continue providing more resources. We are also planning a new survey to assess the field again at this point and ask some different questions. So we will be sharing some information about that through some infographics and future presentations as we continue talking about emergency aid around the country. So there will be more coming from that as well. And we are hosting a convening about emergency aid in January, where we will bring together a group of people to talk about what's been happening and to come up with some additional moving forward direction to go and things that we can do together as a team to work for this. So there's really a lot coming, and I also welcome any other suggestions or questions or things that Student Arc needs to provide to support what you're doing or the questions that you have. So definitely reach out if you have any requests for things, and I'll be happy to try to put you in touch with other institutions that I know are doing something related or would be a good resource for you.
Awesome. I think that's super helpful. So the next question that we have, I think maybe we'll do two more questions. So the next question I think I'll take a stab at, and then I can pass it to you, Amy, if you have any additional thoughts. But is there something we can do on an individual level in terms of advocacy at the state and local levels of addressing food insecurity for students? And I think that NASPA is, really aware of our membership wanting more opportunities to engage in the advocacy space. I think that a way, is information sharing. I didn't speak to state level policies regarding food insecurity. That's something that we do track. So, if you realize that there's something going on in your state that could jeopardize the needs of your students in terms of their social safety net or whatnot, local-based advocacy efforts are a great way to start. We have resources on some of that. We have resources on if you wanted to do a letter writing campaign on campus, resources around, of course, like civic engagement, and voter-based resources for students on campuses and that kind of a thing. So if you're interested in those kinds of resources, they are available through NASPA, and we can certainly, if you reach out to one of us, we can certainly provide those links and resources to you if you're interested in getting more involved. Amy, did you have any thoughts on that question?
I think that was a great answer. Thank you, Diana.
Okay. Yeah, and advocacy is a really big conversation. So the next question that we have is, do you see many schools who have various pockets of funds across their campus but aren't talking to one another? So I guess a barrier around streamlining, where students are feeling like they're getting the runaround because there's so many pockets of funding that there's not just one place for them to apply to all the resources at once.
That certainly is happening, which is part of the reason why that's one of the points in this is trying to have that combined effort and integrated process across campus. So it's really helpful if you can get all the different people that have those different funding sources together to talk about how to handle those kind of situations and whether there should be a combined effort from the entire institution to pool all of that or to handle it in a certain way, or if certain types of requests go to a certain place than others. But really, that's one of the important things about getting everyone together and having that conversation so everyone knows what everyone else is doing, and you can have a conversation about making it an objective and clear process for students so that we don't have them having that run around. So that definitely is happening, and we're trying to help with that. That's a part of the reality that we found out in doing this study and to get into this work, is that lots of people were helping in lots of different ways and didn't know anyone else at their own institution was doing something like that. So some of it's just trying to catch everybody up and get everyone around the same table to start those conversations.
Thank you. All right, well, Amy, thank you so much for joining us today for our policy briefing series. And the recording and the slides will be available through the online learning community, so look for that in the coming week. And I want to just pass it to you, Amy, if you have any closing thoughts before we end our session today.
I appreciate everyone being here and asking thoughtful questions and being involved in this conversation. As Diana mentioned, we will share this. I'll put all the notes in there so everything will be available, and you're certainly welcome to download the report, the emergency aid landscape analysis, that will share a lot of different statistics and background on this. So we will be happy to share that and more if anyone has any questions after this. But again, thank you so much for being engaged in this, and let us know how Student ARC can serve you and support the work that you are doing.
Okay, thank you so much. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Goodbye.